Hello and welcome to the Power Tools podcast by Workbench Energy. Welcome to our third episode here on the Power Tools podcast. We talk about things related to energy management in the province of Ontario. Today, we've got an exciting topic. We're going to be talking about emissions from electricity. So, as it is increasingly important for companies and energy managers in Ontario, understanding how you quantify, measure, and report on emissions is an increasingly important topic. And so today we're going to dive into that with two guests that we have today. One, Elissa Williamson. Elissa's been with us before here on the Power Tools podcast. She's our Director of Commercial and Industrial Services at Workbench, also our resident energy manager. And we also have Tony Pringle from Quinn+Partners. He's the co-founder, engagement manager of Quinn+Partners, where they're a strategic management consultancy in the sustainability business. So, hey, Tony, how's it going?
Doing well, Cam. Thank you very much for having me on.
And hello, Elissa.
Hi, Cam.
All right. So, Tony, I did a very brief introduction for you there, but maybe you can start with a bit more of an introduction for Quinn+Partners and yourself.
Perfect. Happy to do so, and thanks again. Just for people listening in, Quinn+Partners, our firm, is a consultancy, a management consultancy, but all we focus on is sustainability or ESG and climate, and we work both with companies and investors, and essentially work with them to develop sustainability and climate strategies for their business, integrate that into their business strategy, and then also help to implement throughout their business so that they can improve sustainable operations and improve climate performance and manage things like climate risk.
Awesome. So, Tony, why does this matter? Why does this matter today for companies? Right? It's increasingly important. There's, I think on a few dimensions, it's an important issue. But how would you describe why sustainability and measuring your emissions and reporting them are important? How is it helping organizations?
Yeah, so I think it's really there'd be multifaceted drivers, and it's going to depend on the company. But really, in the end, it is a business issue. And whether or not that's directly related to carbon pricing or potential future carbon pricing, there's an operational efficiency side, but then there's also a big driver from regulations as well. Increasingly, regulatory drivers to disclose carbon, and moving forward, likely to reduce depending on sector. The national and provincial goals for carbon reductions are going to be cascaded down, and in particular industries, that means you're going to have to be reducing in line with accepted climate pathways so that we can move towards what the globe has agreed is the goal of net zero by 2050. And then in addition to all those drivers, stakeholders is a huge one as well. So customers demand low carbon products, so they want to know in their supply chain that suppliers they're using are providing low carbon products, and they're starting to ask more questions. And investors would be a huge driver as well, who are also setting their own net zero mandates and wanting to understand emissions profiles of companies that they invest in, and making sure that those are in line with trajectories towards net zero as well.
All things that are important. So then, help us understand, as people are thinking about emissions from their company and from their commercial or industrial facility. We've got scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. I want to kind of pivot our discussion pretty quickly into scope 2, electricity related emissions. But maybe just as a general background, could you help us sort of understand the difference between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions?
I will do my best. Really simple explanation, and it is something that I don't think 5 years ago many people would have heard those terms, but starting to hear more and more. Essentially, scope 1 emissions are emissions that you are directly emitting from your operations. So if you're burning some sort of fuel on site, or in a generator, or in a vehicle that has emissions coming from it, those are scope 1 emissions. They're coming directly from your operations and from the emission of fossil fuels, or of greenhouse gases rather, from your operations. Scope 2 are emissions that are indirect emissions that come from the purchase of energy. So essentially, when you purchase electricity, there aren't emissions coming from your operations. They're coming from the generators of that electricity. But it's such a common thing that every business, every organization will have purchased energy, that is a very core category. And scope 1 and 2 are therefore the really primary ones. Scope 3 then extends upstream and downstream. So the goods that you purchase had carbon going into producing them. Your employees emit carbon on their way to work. Upstream and downstream emissions, those are scope 3.
That was succinct. And so, not surprisingly, given the way you've described this, many of the tasks of these organizations would fall to an energy manager if you had a dedicated energy manager, at least to understand scope 2 emissions and scope 1 as well. So I guess, Elissa, having been an energy manager, being our in-house energy manager, can you talk a little bit about how this lands on the energy manager's plate and some of the things that you're thinking about as an energy manager trying to deal with scope 1 and scope 2 emissions particularly?
Yeah, definitely can. So as Tony mentioned, organizations are coming up with targets, and they're based on science, and they're based on where we have to be down the road. The energy manager side is really, the middleman. They're essentially given these targets, and it's their job to figure out how to execute and deliver the projects that will, get the resulting reduction in emissions. So there's lots of ways energy managers are doing this. They're looking at energy conservation, so using less, energy efficiency, using the electricity better or the energy better, and energy demand, which can take into account the carbon intensity at any given time. So through initiatives like load shifting or load shedding or load displacement, such as battery storage. So depending on the size of the organization, sometimes the energy manager is simply tracking the energy consumption and recording it, or they can be tasked with calculating the emissions if they're smaller. So really, the energy manager is tasked with figuring out how to execute the projects that are necessary to get us to where we need to be.
Right, and so part of this is kind of to both of you is about figuring out emissions factors for different causes of emissions within your operation, right? And so when it comes to combusting natural gas, for example, there's a known emissions factor. So the amount the amount of gas that you've combusted, you can apply an emissions factor and get your CO2 equivalent from that. When it comes to electricity, and we're pivoting to scope 2 emissions, it's a little bit trickier, right? Because I think the way that most folks are reporting their scope 2 emissions today relies on an emission factor that's a number of years old, likely coming from the National Inventory Report. And we know year over year, the carbon intensity of the electricity grid is changing, right? So if you're reporting on emissions that are from a factor that was 2 years ago, it's not going to be accurate. And in fact, we've seen some recent reports saying that the emission factor in Ontario from electricity is going up by as much as 400% in the next decade or so. So I guess Tony, question to you, how should energy managers be thinking about this dynamic and dealing with, I guess, a more challenging emission factor than something like combusting gas or oil?
Yeah, so I mean, step back for 1 second just to sort of reinforce the importance of that scope 1, scope 2. because those are the metrics that essentially everyone has to report on.
Right.
So all of the sustainability, ESG reporting standards, the core ones like SASB and TCFD, which are sort of some very core standards that are now being applied by the Canadian government, by the SEC in the US. All of those require companies to report on their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions.
Yes.
And so that's the absolute, those are sort of the organizational emissions performance metrics that everyone's measured against. And you're compared against other companies in your industry using those. Those are sort of the performance, your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, that's the core. As you said, you calculate Scope 1 emissions, and that's pretty straightforward because you do have just the emissions factors for what those fuels are. But then for electricity, essentially what we'd be doing is using average electricity or using the total electricity over a year, and then multiplying that by an emissions factor. In the case of Canada, it comes in their national inventory report, and that national inventory report comes out, and those emissions factors are 3 years old. And at this point in time, that is really what almost the state of the industry is. That's what everybody would be using to be calculating that. But it's not extremely accurate because it's 3 years old, and you're using your energy over the course of the year and just multiplying it by that standard emissions factor. So it's old, it's out to date, but it's really the best approved emissions factors that the general population has access to. And I think where we are now is we're really sort of moving from emissions being broader strokes. We're wanting to understand general order of magnitude, and in those cases then yes, those emissions factors, that was the best we had, and that gave you an order of magnitude. But now that we're starting to really track towards some of these goals and targets and net zero, having more accurate data is quite important. But the challenge is that often those emissions factors from electricity, the best available is still those national inventory reports, and those are about 3 years old.
Yeah, and as soon as you not to stop at the year-over-year changes in electricity. I mean, we have electricity that changes in carbon intensity season to season, even within a year, season to season, day to day, hour to hour, right? So there's a lot of work to do on getting those emissions intensities much more precise. And in fact, it's something that we've been working on at Workbench Energy. Elissa, you're been deeply involved with the development of our grid carbon service. I guess, do you want to maybe provide a little bit of information about how we're trying to tackle this particular issue around getting real-time hourly carbon emissions?
Sure, yeah. And look, Cam, I mean, like Tony said, right, the National Inventory Report is it's the most up-to-date number that we have, and it's what energy managers have been using, right? I think as we progress and try to dial in more accurately what our emissions profiles are, it's really important that energy managers understand what the carbon intensity of the grid is and how it's changing. I mean, the goal overall is to reduce emissions for the entire organization, whether it's Scope 1, 2, or 3. But where it comes into being really critical is when you're looking at reducing, say, your Scope 1 emissions through, say, electrification. It really becomes key that you understand what the carbon intensity of the grid is that you're considering switching to really understand whether that's the right or wrong decision, right? So, I mean, the grid carbon service that we've been looking at is really intended to give energy managers that tool and that additional insight to make better decisions. And I'm really proud of where we're getting it to. I think a lot of energy managers are going to find it really useful, and it's going to help a lot of organizations meet their targets.
Yeah, and having that information, an example I can think of right off the bat is, well, if you're using just an annual average emissions factor, you might think that a greenhouse gas project like LED lights in the parking lot, for example, might be a good economic payback, but also provide you a good carbon reduction because it's producing X number of megawatt hours over the year. But if power in the middle of the night or in the overnight when it's dark tends to be less carbon intensive than that during the day, right? If you were looking at a comparable project that was, dealing with power when it's at its most carbon intensive, you might make a different decision if you had that kind of information. So that's an example of where that might be useful. I guess so. As folks think about how they use the carbon intensity and hourly emissions versus sort of an annual emissions coming from multiple years prior, Tony, what kind of considerations do you think energy managers should be thinking about as they consider using different factors, more up-to-date factors, but I guess not from something like the National Inventory Report? What kind of guidance would you have for energy managers thinking about making this change?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you're looking to make a change, number one is that you do need to know that it's in line with accepted greenhouse gas accounting protocols and standards. So that would be one thing to say, okay, well, is this aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol, ISO 14001? Is this acceptable to use? So long as it is, though, actually, that would be the sort of more optimal standard to use. And we're actually seeing greenhouse gas accounting standards evolve now to actually account for that and to actually give, there's an investor greenhouse gas accounting standard called PCAF, which is carbon accounting for financial institutions. And they do allocate scores, and actually the best score that you can have for carbon accounting is at that, direct from the facility level. So as long as it's meeting the requirements of greenhouse gas protocol, that would be sort of the minimum threshold. But then if it is, then that's high quality data, and that's better quality data that you can be using. Then I'd start to think about, okay, how do you use that to optimize? If it's okay to use to report and that's okay to use to account for, then as you were sort of indicating, Cam, it's very much moving into how does this inform decisions and more accurate accounting, but decisions on reducing carbon emissions. You can actually start to look more closely at what the drivers of emissions are and do the sort of factoring of what's the marginal cost abatement for different strategies that you have to reduce carbon. The interesting thing, and I think we're sort of alluding to and touching on this with Elissa, is that in actual fact that the role of energy manager should maybe be shifted, and it's now called sort of energy and carbon manager, frankly. And because of these new targets and goals that you're needing to achieve, and these are, as I said, regulated countries have agreed to these, investors are setting these targets, it's been defined what these pathways are for different industries. So we know actually, this is the direction it's going in. We know actually the pace and slope that we need to go at. But it's a new factor that energy managers have to optimize for. And so it's not just about reducing energy, it's about reducing energy and carbon, and the ability to look at different drivers, as you mentioned, that night lighting retrofit that may actually not reduce carbon might not be the best strategy if you're trying to achieve your carbon goals in terms of what you should optimize first. Maybe it's an HVAC upgrade or something like that that's going to reduce more of your peak daytime demand for energy as opposed to nighttime demand. So those are the things that I think you'd start considering if you had access to this data, is you could really start optimizing for carbon emission reduction or greenhouse gas emission reduction as well, which is needed to meet company goals, to meet investor goals, and to meet national goals.
Well said.
Well said. I think we did a podcast recently that Elissa was talking about some of the roles of energy managers, and one of them very much is the sustainability part of it, right? And so it seems like that part of the role is increasingly important and getting a lot more attention.
Absolutely, and I think especially on the carbon front, I mean, sustainability can mean a lot of things, and it can mean stakeholder relations and diversity, equity, inclusion, but the role of managing carbon is so directly tied to energy that I think that one in particular really does fall on the energy management, and it is a new dimension that you need to look at. It's a new angle.
Well, this has been great. I mean, I hope that we've been able to share some information about, how the emissions are categorized, how companies are thinking about it, and the benefits of setting targets and of reporting your emissions, as well as how it's relating to energy managers and what they're doing on the ground. And finally, as you get into your Scope 2 emissions, different ways of thinking about emission factors, and that there are increasingly ways that you can dial in hourly emission factors and not use outdated numbers. As more things electrify, that number needs to be known, and you can't manage what you can't measure accurately. So on that note, thanks so much, Tony, for joining us. Thanks, Elissa, for joining us again today, and have a great day.